Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's member-only webinar. We are going to get started here in about another minute or so, but we're going to give individuals a chance to log in as it looks like we've got a number of people coming in at the moment. So please stand by and we will begin here shortly. All right, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. I do want to welcome everyone. My name is Anthony Salas, and on behalf of Welcoming America, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar that's titled Building a More Inclusive Economy, Lessons from the Urban Institute's Research on Inclusive Recovery. At Welcoming America, we make every effort to provide you, our members, with content and information that supports the work you are doing within your community, and our webinars are just one way that we do that. I invite you to go to our website to access past webinars as well as other resources, and you can do that by going to welcomingamerica.org/learn/resources. And from there you can type in a topic or keywords, and that will bring up a list of all of the resources that are available for you. During today's presentation, if you have any questions, I do invite you to enter those into the chat feature as the presentation goes on, and we will be addressing questions at the end of the full presentation. But again, definitely enter those as they come to mind, so we'll have those ready to go at the end. And at this point, I would like to introduce our speakers joining us today. All are joining from the Urban Institute. And we have Hamutal Bernstein, who is the Income and Benefits Policy Center Senior Research Associate. Brady Meixell, who is the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center Research Analyst. And Martha Fedorowicz, who is the Research to Action Lab Policy Analyst. And they are going to be sharing, obviously, a lot of great information with you as we go through this presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Martha, who is going to start today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Anthony. We really appreciate that very kind introduction, and want to thank everyone for joining us today. Just getting my screen pulled up here. All right. Hopefully you guys can all see everything. Get this. Go back a few slides. So anyway, I'm Martha Fedorowicz. I'm a policy analyst in the Research to Action Lab in the Urban Institute. The Research to Action Lab is an innovation hub serving decision makers and creative thinkers eager to affect social change. We draw on the breadth and depth of the Urban Institute's research insights to test new strategies and develop cutting-edge tools programs, and trainings, as well as to provide strategic and philanthropic advice to public, nonprofit, and private sector leaders. And as Anthony mentioned, today I'm joined by Hamutal, Bernstein, and Brady Meixell from the Urban Institute. On our webinar today, we'll be sharing some of the work that the Urban Institute does under our immigrants and immigration portfolio. Then we'll dive into the inclusive recovery research that was conducted in 2017 and 2018. We'll share some practical lessons for your policy and practice that you could replicate in your own communities, and some resources that you can use. We'll also end with about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A to respond to any questions you might have. So first, I'll introduce Hamutal Bernstein. Hamutal is a Principal Research Associate in the Income and Benefits Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where she leads Urban's portfolio on immigrants and immigration. She is a Principal Investigator on the Annual Survey of Refugees and Survey Redesign for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Before joining Urban, she was a Program Officer at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, managing public opinion survey research in the United States and Europe.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be with you today. This is Hamutal. I'm a big fan of Welcoming America and have really enjoyed working with different members and the national organization through previous National Immigrant Integration Conference proceedings and other activities. So I'm really excited to be here with you all. You guys are one of our key audiences here at Urban and the work that we do on a broad range of areas, touching on immigration issues and immigrants, immigrant families, immigrants, and the children of immigrants. So there's a whole lot of different areas of work going on at Urban. We're about 500 plus people here, and there's work in justice policy and healthcare and the social safety net and housing, all of these different areas. And I think one of the things we bring is sort of a lens thinking about both immigration issues and immigrants as a core population that may be of interest in these different areas that we study nationally and in different communities across the U.S. So in terms of our work around immigrants and immigration, there's a lot, but there are three kind of main areas, main kind of activities that we focus on here. So I'll go through them and give you just a few examples of some of our most current project work in some of those areas, just to give you a feel. So first of all, we're really interested in the impact of local, state, and federal immigration policies and practices on communities across the country. Some of the exciting work that we're doing in this area most recently has been some original quantitative and qualitative data collection around the chilling effects that immigrant families are experiencing in the context of our immigration policy climate, whether that's around the public charge rule or the whole other array of attacks on immigrant communities across the country. And so we've been doing some survey collections, some interview work, and actually we're in the midst of doing some work in 5 communities right now across the U.S. trying to understand how this is happening in your communities, how service providers are responding, and what are some effective strategies for minimizing those chilling effects that we're hearing a lot about and seeing showing up in the national survey data and administrative data. We put out some work last year, and we're working on some new pieces that'll be coming out in the spring and summer of this year. Secondly, we think a lot about how to connect low-income immigrant families to supports and how to make systems work better to support immigrants and the children of immigrants in our communities. There's some exciting work around early childhood education, around health insurance, nutrition, language access, a wide array of issues that different colleagues around the Institute are releasing intermittently. Last, and I think this is kind of a piece of why we're talking to you today, is we really think a lot about how to help practitioners do evidence-driven policymaking and how we can make data and research and evidence accessible and relevant to you all. One of the core examples we have at Urban, which we just released the update about 2 weeks ago now, is the Children of Immigrants data tool. In there, we provide like a data visualization where you can look at metro level data for your metropolitan region about immigrant kids and immigrant families, and also see how it fits into the national landscape. And then we also do a lot of work around refugee resettlement. As Martha mentioned, we do some data collection on behalf of the Office of Refugee Resettlement in HHS. Through that, we've learned a lot about how you measure refugee integration. In that work, we conduct a national representative sample survey of recently arrived refugees in the U.S. We've also worked with Switchboard, which is the formal technical assistance provider to refugee resettlement actors across the U.S. And I know there are lots of refugees in a lot of the cities and jurisdictions that are participating today, so I hope that Switchboard is on your radar. If you want to see any of this work, you can check out our webpage on the Cross Center Initiative. It's www.urban.org/immigration. And you can find all this work there. And please do sign up for our newsletter, which we release a couple times a year, where we share new research and results that we're putting out.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Hamutal. Next, I'll turn it over to Brady Meixell, presenting Inclusive Recovery Research. Brady is a research analyst in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center. His work focuses on community and economic development, racial and economic disparities, and place-based interventions to address poverty and related issues.
Thank you, Martha. Well, first, I want to mention some of the rest of the team that went into this fantastic inclusive recovery research. Erica Posig, Solomon Green, Tina Stacy, Tanaya Srini, Stephen Brown, and Diana Elliott. And thanks to the Kresge Foundation for their support making this work possible. Today, I'll be speaking to what we found in our research on inclusive recovery across 274 large and mid-sized U.S. cities, covering 1980 through 2013. So I'm going to be talking through the methods, how we define and measure an inclusive recovery, some of the broad findings across our full sample of 274 cities, and then our findings from the 41 cities we studied which underwent economic recovery. Then I'll be passing it back over to Martha, who will walk through some lessons learned about how to drive inclusive recovery based on case studies we conducted in 4 cities from our sample. And then finally, as many of your cities are included in this analysis, I'll be speaking to how you can access some of these data online. I do want to note this research doesn't separate out immigrant and refugee populations in our analyses. However, I think the findings around how racial and economic inclusion are linked to economic recovery and growth will be useful in your own work and framing strategies, particularly as it pertains to economic arguments around the value of welcoming immigrants and refugees. And later on, Martha will be speaking to the example of Lowell, Massachusetts, and how their Cambodian refugee population played a central role in the city's inclusive recovery. All right, so first of all, let's start by defining our terms. What do we mean by inclusive recovery? Well, an inclusive recovery occurs when a place overcomes economic distress in a way that enables its residents, especially historically excluded populations, to share in benefiting from and contributing to economic growth. So why are we focusing on inclusive recovery in cities? Well, we wanted to understand the linkage between economic recovery and inclusivity. Much of the research to date is focused on either economic recovery or spurring inclusive growth in isolation. And in fact, some of the conventional wisdom was that it's difficult to do both at the same time. Some people would claim that you couldn't both grow the pie and distribute it in the same time span. Our research indicates that this is not the case, and that economic recovery and becoming more inclusive can in fact go hand in hand. But cities have to be intentional in these efforts. So why do we look at cities rather than another geography? Well, 2 main reasons. Looking at a broader region, such as a metropolitan area, could mask inter-region disparities. An area's suburbs and its primary city can be made up of very different populations. And if a portion of a region is performing well, either economically or on inclusivity, this could mask other portions of the region that may be lagging behind. But even more importantly, when thinking at the local level, it's city governments that really have the ability to craft policy that can actually advance inclusion. There are also many local stakeholders who are seeking to create local change on these issues, whether that be community groups, CDCs, advocacy organizations that organize themselves at the city level rather than the MSA or region. All right, so we've talked through how we define inclusion, but how do we operationalize this definition and how do we measure it? So we've created 4 indices to measure inclusivity and economic growth. And in a moment, I'm going to go through exactly what each of these indices is comprised of. But to start at kind of a broader level, so our first index is economic health. This is how we understand a city's economy. So there's no measure of a city's gross domestic product, GDP, but this is our best attempt to get at this. This is a raw measurement of economic output and does not capture inclusion whatsoever. We use this index to understand when a city has recovered economically, which we define as moving from the bottom third of our sample, economically distressed, into the top half of our sample, economically healthy. Our economic inclusion index is meant to capture the extent of a resident's ability to both benefit from and contribute to economic growth in a city, particularly for lower income residents. Our racial inclusion index assesses the inclusion of historically excluded populations by measuring disparities between white residents and residents of color. And finally, our overall inclusion index is the composite of both our economic and racial inclusion metrics.
Okay.
All right, so diving into each of these individually now. Economic health. So we look at 4 measures to track economic health in a city. The first of which, employment change, is the percentage change in number of people in the labor force employed between years. So that's capturing job growth. Then we look at housing vacancy rate. So that's meant to capture the health of the local housing market, and it's often one of the first inputs to shift in a changing market. We track median family income to get a measurement of families' relative prosperity. And we use family income rather than household income because families are kind of a typical economic unit we're considering. And then finally, we look at unemployment rate. For economic inclusion, so across this index, we're trying to avoid any sort of data measure that might actually be capturing displacement rather than improvements on inclusion. So we want to make sure that lower income residents are being included in the overall economy, not just being displaced beyond the borders of the city. So that's why we're not actually using poverty rate as a measure of economic inclusion here. So first off, we look at income segregation. So we're comparing the variations in family income across census tracts, across incomes. So we're trying to get at, is there a mix of incomes within each neighborhood of a city? Then we look at rent burden. So we're capturing housing affordability here. And while the typical rule of thumb around rent burden is 30% or more of income spent on rent, we're actually using 35% here. That's a data limitation going back to 1980. That's what was available. We look at working poor. So that is the percent of families with at least one householder working full-time who are still below the poverty line. So we're trying to capture that quality of life for low-income residents. And then we also look at a proxy for high school dropout rate. That's the percent of 16 to 19-year-olds neither employed or in school. And for racial inclusion, so I want to note kind of off the bat here that the way we're looking at racial disparities is in many ways an oversimplification. We're comparing across these metrics non-Hispanic whites to all populations of color. This is not necessarily ideal and can paper over different group experiences of races and ethnicities by lumping them into this broad bucket. We chose to construct our measures this way in an attempt to understand racial disparity across all cities and regions in the country comparatively. So in some cities, the prevailing racial disparities we want to capture between African American residents and white residents. In other cities, it might be the non-Hispanic versus Hispanic disparities that might be most relevant. And still in others, there might be subpopulations of Asian Americans that might face unique barriers to inclusion. Additionally, looking at more precise group-based disparities is, in some cases, be problematic across our full sample of cities, as some populations in various cities would be too small to accurately measure without large margins of error. So this is not a perfect measure, and hopefully future research can also look at more granular group-based disparities along racial inclusion. The racial inclusion metric index that we put together, you'll notice is kind of in some ways paralleling our economic inclusion index across kind of the broad categories we're looking at here. So we've got a segregation measure. We're looking at racial segregation. So we use a dissimilarity index. So this is the extent to which people of color and non-Hispanic whites are equally distributed across each census tract in a city. We look at home ownership gap here rather than rent burden as we had in the economic inclusion index. And part of the reason we're doing that is that historically in this country, home ownership has been such a key driver of the wealth divide. So we wanted to capture that in our index. We look at education gap. So that's the difference between residents of color and non-Hispanic white residents 25 years or older that have a bachelor's degree or higher. We look at poverty gap. And then finally, we look at the percentage residents of color. So we wanted to kind of capture that overall diversity of the city as well. All right. So, once we kind of compile all of these indexes, we rank all 274 cities across our sample in each study year on each of these measurement indexes. So we're ranking from the most healthy or most inclusive, which is 1, to the least healthy or inclusive at 274. And we're not only worried about kind of that absolute measure, but we also want to capture progress made over periods on inclusion. And we want to give credit where cities are making great gains to inclusion, even if they're not necessarily the highest absolute inclusion ranking. All right, so what did we learn from this work? Well, first of all, you can take a quick look here at what cities are covered in our sample. So we included any city that has a population of 100,000 or more residents in either 1980, 1990, 2000, or 2011 to 15. So that gave us 274 cities across the country. So as you can see, the cities in our analysis are spread kind of across all regions. And blue dots here represent the 41 cities that recovered economically at some point since 1980. Yellow dots show cities that were economically healthy in all 4 points in time that we looked at. Gray dots represent cities that were stressed economically in all 4 of these periods. And then black dots show any kind of other combination of economic health over those periods. So of the 211 cities in which Welcoming America's members currently operate, we have data on 111 of these in the study. All right, so what is the key takeaway that we found across all of our cities? We found a strong relationship between the economic health of a city and a city's ability to support inclusion for its residents. So we looked at all of our cities across kind of every single 10-year or 13-year period here, and we sorted them into either healthy economic health, recovered, distressed, or other. And as you can see here, healthy cities have the highest ranking across all 3 inclusion indices by significant margins. You can also see that there's a stronger relationship between economic health and economic inclusion than there is between economic health and racial inclusion. All right, now zooming into just those 41 recovered cities in particular. So you can see kind of where they are across our map here. Of the 41 cities that experienced economic recovery in our sample since 1980, 9 of those cities have Welcoming America members. Many have multiple organizations. So that's 17 Welcoming America organizations in total across these the 9 cities of the 41 there. So cities with blue dots on this map are cities that had gains on inclusion during their period of economic recovery. The yellow dots have declines on inclusion during their period of economic recovery. And the size of the dot here is representing the size of the change, either in gain or in decline. All right. So you can see the second column in this table shows the years between which each city went from economically distressed to economically healthy. That third column is showing the city's ranking on over-inclusion in our most recent year of analysis, 2013. And the closer you are to 1, the best rank in our sample, that's the darker blue that you're getting here. The closer to the worst ranking, 274, is the darkest yellow. And then that final column is showing the change in overall inclusion ranking during that period of recovery. So this is what I talked about a little bit earlier, but being concerned not just about absolute ranking, but how a city can make progress over time. So 23 of the 41 recovered cities we looked at made gains in inclusion, some by quite substantial amounts, at the same time as they recovered economically. So this is showing that you don't necessarily have to first economically recover and then become more inclusive. Those two can go hand in hand. And we don't prove causation here, so we don't know, if one is driving the other. There could be other factors in this relationship. But we do know that certainly both can occur together. But at the same time, an economic recovery does not guarantee greater inclusivity. In fact, of those 41 recovered cities, 18 lost ground in inclusion over the recovery period. So some key takeaways from this work. Economic health is positively correlated with inclusion, but recovery does not automatically mean that you're more inclusive. Rather, cities must employ intentional strategies, particularly when making decisions around allocation of resources. So you might find yourself asking, how can cities be intentional about generating inclusive growth? And I'm going to turn it over to Martha, who hopefully can explain some of the answers to that question.
Thank you, Brady. So we presented you with a lot of information about how we conducted the research and hopefully laid the groundwork for understanding what inclusion looks like. Now we'll dive a little deeper into some lessons for all of you to take back to your work. So in doing this research and identifying specific case studies, one of which we'll dive into a little further in a moment, the researchers identified 8 common elements of an inclusive recovery and important implications for practice. These are adopt a shared vision, build and sustain bold public leadership, recruit partners from across sectors, leverage assets and intrinsic advantages, think and act regionally, build voice and power, reframe inclusion as integral to growth, and lay the building blocks of inclusion. And I should mention that even if your city has already recovered, these building blocks can still be helpful to think about how to create more inclusivity in your community. So let's dive deeper into 3 of these building blocks. For each of these, I'll share a specific example from one of our case study cities to demonstrate what this looks like in practice. So leveraging intrinsic advantage requires supporting racial and ethnic diversity and treating diversity as a valuable community asset, building from the strength of local assets, and utilizing city-owned infrastructure to strengthen fiscal position and promote inclusion. So of course, as you all know, cities possess unique attributes that can drive inclusive growth, and these can be physical assets or tied to the people who live there. So from the study, one of the sample cities was Midland, Texas, which is located near the Permian Basin, which is an oil field that has provided a lot of benefits for the community. Recognizing that the community had a human capital shortage, local foundations came together to establish a free tuition program for students graduating from the local school district so that they could attend the University of Texas from the Permian Basin. And much of the funds used to fund that tuition program came from the community's oil wealth. So that's just one example of this. Building power and voice. So this requires investments in community institutions, services, and organizing, preserving political power and ensuring fair representation, and an explicit focus on racial equity. So inclusive growth, as Brady mentioned, is predicated upon building power among historically excluded groups and disinvested communities. So some examples of this are in Louisville, Kentucky. In 2003, there was a merger between the city and the county. And the University of Kentucky's Department of Geography helped redraw the council district after the merger to create some majority African-American districts in the city to ensure representation. Another example that I'll talk a bit more about in a moment was in Lowell, Massachusetts, where the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association, which was originally founded as a refugee resettlement agency, works to promote a broad range of services for immigrants from many countries and works specifically to promote civic engagement through voter registration. And the third one is lay the building blocks for inclusion through investments in educational initiatives that are outcomes focused and encourage opportunity for historically disadvantaged groups. Revenue sharing, tax incentives, and fiscal policies that support balanced regional growth and neighborhood revitalization, and develop and preserve affordable housing to minimize displacement and ensure existing residents can share in economic growth. So again, these are all things that communities should deliberately focus on to promote racial and economic inclusion. So we wanted to share one example from the research that we thought would resonate with Welcoming American members, and that's the case study that was done on Lowell, Massachusetts. So Lowell's a city of about 109,000 people located 30 miles northeast of Boston. Until the mid-20th century, its economy was largely driven by textile manufacturing, and in the 1980s, Lowell was part of the Massachusetts miracle tech boom. However, the city lost one of its major employers in the 1990s that at the time was employing over 10% of the city's workforce. So this was a huge loss to the community. However, between 1990 and 2000, according to our research, Lowell experienced a recovery. They moved up 31 rankings in economic inclusion and 75 in racial inclusion. So how did this happen? So there were a couple of things that the city did specifically to get to that point. So despite the loss of one of the city's largest employers, the city continued to prosper. One of the things they did was to redevelop the city's historic mills through loans provided by the Lowell Development and Financial Corporation. This was really important because that redevelopment provided ready-made infrastructure for housing and offices. They also focused on maintaining a base of skilled labor, added some new employers like the University of Massachusetts Lowell and some other tech-focused businesses. There was also an influx of immigrants during this time, specifically a large Cambodian population that came into the city. By 2000, 22% of the city's population was foreign-born. Of additional note here, as the people of color population increased in the city, the relative residential segregation in the city decreased. So people weren't moving to kind of isolated pockets where they were living in segregated communities. They were really living in quite diverse neighborhoods. And the last thing is that the city created the Southeast Asian Water Festival, which celebrates Southeast Asian cultures, and has really come to be one of the city's most celebrated annual events, and bringing a lot of revenue and tourism into the city. And with that, I'll turn it back to Brady.
So after hearing some of the lessons Martha presented, you may be wondering about where your own city, your starting point is today, as well as its performance over time on a few of these metrics. So we put together an interactive site where you can view the data on all 274 cities in our sample, and we've got a link to that at the end of this slideshow. But so when you pull up that site, you can see through this data feature, explore how cities across the country have fared on our inclusion indices over time. So you can see based on this interactive map we've created. You can explore some of the trends that we've seen over time. Some of our key research questions are profiled here, such as how each of the inclusion indices relates to economic health. You can click on any dot and see which city it represents on this graph and others. And then finally, you can go deep into particular cities. You can dive right into the data on your city or any other city in our sample. So you select the city you're interested in from our drop-down menu, and you can see how that city ranks on each of the 4 composite indices we've created from 1980 to 2013, as well as the 13 underlying indicators that make up these indices. So if you're interested in learning more about these analyses or case studies, we've included the link to the full report up top. And the data tool I just mentioned is at the second link here. If you have any questions that we don't have a chance to get to today or think of something later on, feel free to reach out to me via email at the email listed above. And with that, I want to open the floor to any questions you have on anything you've heard today.
Great. Thanks so much, Brady. Appreciate that. I think what I'd like to do too is, if you don't mind, let's leave this slide up here since we are referencing the links where people can go to see more. So we'll leave this up for a bit, and also note to everyone that as part of the follow-up, we'll make sure that these links are included in the follow-up emails that you'll receive after today's webinar, so you can go to these sites too. But before we go into questions, just a reminder, if you have any questions, use the chat feature. Enter your questions in there now so we can go ahead and start working through those. And with that, we'll go ahead and take our first question that came in. Question for you is, for the change in economic inclusion metric that you shared earlier, does a higher number demonstrate more change, for example, more positive progress, or does it demonstrate a lower ranking?
Yeah. So a higher number on the economic inclusion index is better. Or sorry, I guess a lower number. The closer you are to 1 is better. So 1 is the best, 274th is the worst, and that's across all 4 of our overall indexes. But speaking to kind of some of the individual variables, higher employment change is better, higher median family income is better, while a lower unemployment rate or a lower vacancy rate is better. We do like a Z-scoring measure to kind of combine all of these. So we're looking at distance from the mean, and so we kind of are able to accommodate for some going higher, some going lower, and that being better relative to those indicators.
Great, thank you for answering that one. Next question is, a lot of the data, or looks like all the data that was shared here is kind of cut off at the 2013 marker. Is there any more recent data that would show any of these data points from 2013 to today, if possible?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. So first of all, that 2013 measure, that's capturing 2011 to 15 5-year ACS data. We're kind of constricted to that 5-year metric because we're looking at some census tract measures that feed into, especially on the segregation measures. However, I'm very happy to announce that we'll be releasing by the end of the year a new update to this data set featuring the latest 2014 to 18 5-year ACS data. So updated data is on the way.
Excellent, good to know. We had a number of people asking about that, so that is answering many questions, so thank you. Let's see here. Actually, I'm going to go back to the first question that I asked earlier about the economic inclusion metric. We've got a follow-up to that. So the follow-up there is hypothetically a -3 ranking on change in economic inclusion would then demonstrate exceptionally positive progress. Is that correct to assume?
Oh, no, that is not correct. So when we're showing some of those change over time charts, we're showing -3 means you've fallen 3 rankings. If we show a +3, a +10, that means you're rising up that many rankings.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And if we need to clarify that a little bit more, please let us know. We're happy to follow up on that question. In the meantime, we'll move on to the next question, which is, you touched briefly on foreign-born populations. Does the research that you looked at, is that specifically looking at foreign-born populations, or was there any other consideration in the mix there?
Yeah, great question. So this research is looking specifically at group-based disparities, but that's residents of color against non-Hispanic white residents. I think this would be a fantastic opportunity for future research potentially, and we would love to create a new index down the line looking at disparities based on foreign-born versus naturally born populations.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Let's see here, next question. Okay, this question touching on the building blocks that you reviewed toward the end here. Question being, one of the 8 building blocks was to reframe inclusion as integral to growth. Can you elaborate a bit on what that means and what it looks like?
Yeah, I'll take this one, Anthony. So, pretty much when cities embrace, economic and racial inclusion principles as part of their growth strategies, we see progress in both areas being heightened. And so, 2 examples that kind of highlight this, one being the Southeast Asian Water Festival that I mentioned in Lowell, which really, I think has been a strong point of civic pride for the immigrant community and for residents, but has also really spurred economic activity by attracting tourists to the area and really further underscores the external value of immigrant cultures. And then also in Louisville, they've really focused on maintaining diverse schools. So, and in doing so, have been able to maintain their tax base as residents aren't howling out the city when they relocate and move to other schools. So at the same time, policy is helping to better integrate residents socially. So that's just a little bit more example on that point.
Great, thank you so much, Martha, appreciate that. Another question that's come in regards to just the data itself and where the site where people can go to kind of look a little bit more at areas around their location. Question being, is there a way to see how my city fares on measures in comparison to other cities around my region?
Oh, great. That's a fantastic question. Let me flip back a few slides to that. Oh, I see. I can't. But we have an option. Once you select your first city, you can then type in a little box, a second comparison city, and see kind of head-to-head how those two cities compare across all of our 13 indicators, as well as the 3 overall metrics. So you can do a little peer city exploration that way.
Great, thank you so much, appreciate that. Taking a quick look here, and it looks like as of right now, we have covered the questions that have come through. I think this has been a lot of information to come at our attendees, so it's probably a lot to take in. But I have a feeling we may have some follow-ups post-webinar, so appreciate you sharing not only the information here on the report and the data, but your email that people can follow up on. So we are going to go ahead and wrap things up here. Hamutal, Brady, and Martha, thank you all so much for taking the time to pull all of this information together for our attendees and for sharing your time with us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Just a couple of notes to our attendees today. As I mentioned, we are recording the full webinar, and we'll be following up with a post-webinar email that will include a link to the recording, so you can go back and listen to all of this information, see the slides, and then I will also make sure that these links are included so you can start exploring some of this data in regards to your own areas here. If you do still have questions post-webinar, send them over to us at events@welcomingamerica.org, and I'll be happy to pass these along to our friends at the Urban Institute. And I do want to invite you to our next member-only webinar that's coming up. It'll be on March 25th, and it's going to be titled Scale Up and Train Your Partners Across Sectors in Immigrant Workforce Integration Best Practices. This will be presented by Upwardly Global, specific to their Jobversity Practitioner Learning Pathway Training Program that has been offered to our members in the past. They're going to share some additional information and also give some examples of how this has worked in some of our welcoming network communities. So if you're interested in joining that webinar, we'll be sending out some information on that very soon. And you can also send me an email at events@welcomingamerica.org, and I'm happy to complete your registration for you. So on behalf of the Urban Institute and everyone at Welcoming America, I want to thank you for joining us today. We hope that we will see you again very soon on another Welcoming America webinar. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.